still haven't played with vibe coding yet. I feel inadequate in some way. But anyway, I thought it was worth mentioning. I gotta say that one of the disappointingly not different things between now and that 70s thing is the lack of diversity in the audience. I hope you guys invite more people next year, although there's some diversity here. But anyway, this was the woman that made me think I could be a scientist. And this is something that I thought, if there's one thing you need to know about biology, it's this. It's absolutely as natural to be cooperative as to be competitive. You are willing to pay a cost. Evolution can even find ways. Bacteria pay costs if they can benefit others. And the relatedness here doesn't have to mean genetic relatedness. In fact, what matters is relatedness on your propensity to be cooperative. So as long as that's contaminative, which it is, both for us socially and also biologically, then you can evolve cooperation. That was actually figured out by Bill Hamilton. My dad bought me Jane Goodall's, Parents Want to Keep You Like You Were When You Were a Kid, and he bought me her biography, which I never would have bought. It was really interesting because she talks about everything, every little weird thing that you would be embarrassed to admit. She believed in reporting everything. And when she first saw chimpanzees having war, she reported it at a meeting like this first before she published it, and people all told her, don't publish it because people will give up on humanity. They'll think that war is inevitable. And so she ignored them. She said, this is what a scientist does. We report what we see. And so then the same people that had told her person on person not to report her thing attacked her as a woman, that she was, she had caused the warfare that she saw in the chimpanzees by provisioning them and things like that. So she went through a lot of attacks. This is the paper where she's not actually an author. One of her students, Richard Wrangham, is the last author on this paper. But they figured out decades later, after many scientists had witnessed chimpanzee warfare, that it tends to be caused when there's not enough resources. So what happens is that chimpanzees can't make too large of a troop because they don't have language and TV and stuff like us. So they can only kind of keep a troop together up to about 120 individuals. So they tend to split. But then if there's a drought or something and there's not enough fruit, we're mostly fruit eaters, the bigger group just wipes out the smaller group, one chimp at a time. And that's warfare in chimpanzees. So that was a really useful, interesting thing to find. It's not something they do for fun. It's something they get motivated to do when they're short of resources. But then they do treat it like a hunting party. So they do also have hunting parties. So it's super interesting, and I think science is important. Anyway, that's not what I was supposed to talk to, but we'll come back to it a little tiny bit in this talk. I actually want to talk about, I guess we know, you can tell from my accent perhaps that although I have a British passport and I just applied for a German passport, because I want my EU passport back, all the British people are going, yes, I get that, right? Nevertheless, I am an American, and I think we have all seen that our people, in some sense, are part of an enormous amount of mayhem in the world right now. So I normally call this talk DevOps versus AGI. I guess I would, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit. But just in case in the unlikely event anybody in the room doesn't know what these terms mean, AGI is artificial general intelligence. Now, if you don't know what that means, that makes sense. There's this guy, Sam Altman, that is going to get paid a lot of money if he creates AGI. And on stage in Paris in February of this year, he said, yeah, nobody knows what it means, so it's kind of a pointless term. But anyway, I'll come up with a definition in a minute. And DevOps, of course, are development and operations. That's what you guys are doing, right? Well, hopefully. I'm sure you're all devs. I hope you all worry about operations too. I've met some security people and stuff, so I assume so. Okay, so AI, one of the many definitions of AGI is sort of AI that's exactly like a person, only somehow immortal and or somehow omnipotent. Okay, and DevOps is the process of creating and maintaining software. And the other difference between them is, of course, AGI is fiction and DevOps is obligatory. You wouldn't believe how many people from our disciplines were telling people from government that DevOps doesn't happen. They're literally saying, we used to program AI, now we don't, the data programs itself, right? What? There's data in this room. Is there like AGI springing out of this? No, right? The point is that this is the kind of narrative that I've been fighting, and that's why I haven't been programming very much lately, for at least a decade. Just going in and telling politicians, no, there's always a person that decides what's the data and which algorithm are you going to use, and when is the tests have been met, and when is it ready for release, and how long are we going to support it, and do we go bankrupt, or do we actually keep supporting our customers, things like that. So I was using AGI, as you saw, sort of as a joke. Did you guys recognize the movie? No? Godzilla versus the smog monster, also from the 1970s, incidentally. Okay, so, all right. So I can't believe this. Yesterday, I was on a panel, okay, it was, should AI have free agency? That's basically AGI. But more concerningly, last week, I was in the European Parliament, the limits of artificial intelligence and the risks of digital superintelligence. This is what people are talking about right now, people in significant places. So at that meeting, at the one in Parliament, they asked me to talk about when AI fails. I don't know, again, I was like the only woman on the panel, and they wanted me to talk about stuff that went wrong. Maybe they wanted me to talk about AI bias. I went on social media. I'm currently using Blue Sky mostly for real interactions. And I said, what do you guys think is the biggest problem with AI, the biggest failure you've seen? and again, another biologist, no doubt, Jane Goodall this morning, said the thing that he had just seen was that there'd been an entire channel devoted to shooting women in the head. Okay, sorry, I didn't know that Jane Goodall was going to die today. I already wrote the slide, right? This is a problem. But this is what I thought was the biggest problem. However this came to be, there was a decision made that Israel should be protected by a small number of cameras. And the reports, sorry to keep bringing this up, the reports of women who were the field operators, it used to be the people that observed Gaza were men and women both, like most of the Israeli military used to be. They took all the men out of it. They had only women, and they were ignored, right? The people on the ground were ignored. All people were ignored. Only these cameras were used as security, and it failed. And so whether or not people thought, we need a trigger, or if it was really completely organic and no one expected it, doesn't matter. Either way, it was a misuse of artificial intelligence. And to me, obviously a devastating one. And it was completely foreseeable. And I can prove this because by some chance, there was somebody taking video the first time I ever heard about it. Eric Schmidt was at some conference and said, we don't want, we don't want to waste the valuable eyes of our military looking for stuff, And I immediately got up and said, wait, wouldn't that, first of all, cause a single point of failure so that every hacker would be going after whatever algorithm you used in these camera systems. But secondly, it would eliminate whistleblowers. Unfortunately, it turns out a lot of people are more worried about whistleblowers than they are about hackers, and that's a real problem. So anyway, the QR codes here are all generated from my Apple. I don't know if you want to trust that, but this goes to the blog post that links to the video if you want to see that. So a lot of people, when they talk about these problems, and I'm sorry to keep picking on Israel right now, but they actually, if as soon as somebody names the programs that the ICE are using in the United States, I'll add those onto these slides. But there was a program called Lavender that was used to choose 35,000 people living and consider them legitimate targets. And I don't even know if there's 35,000 buildings in Gaza. It sounded like a way to just generate a lot of targets. But worse than that is that they also had a program to figure out when a target was at home with their family. And that was when they blew them up. okay? So some people really say, this is like AI that's worse. This is why we shouldn't use AI. Now, we all know, we just saw an example this morning, we all know that you can use AI for good too, right? But the point is, somebody, and this isn't up to us perhaps, maybe it's just up to the Israelis, someone needs to know who made the decisions, how this is coded, whether it's random or if there's really good reason to think all of those 35,000 people are terrorists, right? This is the kind of thing that we want to be able to do with DevOps. A lot of people, when they ask me to talk about AI ethics, expect me to talk about bias, because actually it's a paper that came out of my evolution of language work. So I have my most highly cited papers about AI bias. But like I said, I don't really think of it as AI ethics. I think of it as evolution of language. But also I'm a woman, so therefore they think I must be going to talk about bias. But I have to admit, as scary as all this stuff is, this is Our World in Data talking about all the ways you die. And you will die, right? We all die. But so it's not, don't be too scared about the heart disease thing. It's like, there's some way you're going to die. But war isn't that big of a deal. And so maybe it is true that we should worry about, bias and femicide and things like that. But anyway, this is where we come back to the chimpanzees. One of the things we're worried about right now is polarization and inequality. And these are things that are at the same level now as they were right before World War I, okay? So that's not good. And they tend to correlate. Everybody's blaming social media on inequality, on polarization. And there was something else sort of similar, the national newspapers, because there was rail and there was telegraph, so that was the new technology of that time, right? So that was the late 19th century. But anyway, this stuff peaked around World War I, and then again, and then there was another financial crash. And at that point, enough people in the elite realized that this scale of inequality isn't good for anyone. It just creates volatility. Even the people at the top don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. When you have so much power and so few people that are so unconstrained, it's almost the definition of war. So this is something where I think all of us, again, I don't know who all of you guys talk to or who you work with, but just reminding everyone that this isn't good and we need to cooperate again is an important part of what we do, right? So in most countries, this correlation has been known for decades. And it's really interesting because it turns out that there's a couple countries where the correlation is not true. Germany and China, all right? And so we were trying to figure this out. And this is actually some of my research in the political economy. We used agent-based modeling for this. We figured out that maybe it isn't inequality itself. So normally when you see behavior, like I just explained about the chimpanzees, if you see behavior where there's a variation, there has to be an explanation. So we started from two assumptions. One is that why would you ever work with a diverse outgroup? Well, because you can solve more problems. When you have diversity, you just have more answers. And so there's some papers showing this. If you look at our paper, it'll cite into these. There's not a huge literature, but there's some papers showing, for example, boards with more diversity have higher payoff. Interestingly, it's not good to have only a token. If there's like only one man or only one woman on the board, it's actually worse than if they're totally homogenous. But other than that, like the best is 50-50. So it's like a Mexican hat that goes up. So you're much better with more diversity. So anyway, that was an assumption that was grounded in science. And then we made this other assumption that there's no science on, but that it sort of makes sense that it's more easy to predict the outcome if you cooperate with others that are just like you. They're more predictable. And so you have a higher probability of succeeding. And then if you look at this graph, this is is there a laser pointer? Let's see, so the y-axis here is the probability of a failure when you cooperate with the outgroup. So we just assumed, for simplicity, that whenever you cooperate with your in-group, it works. But we also assume that there's a higher payoff for working with the outgroup. So the question is, how much can you put up with the risk of failure and still make it make sense to work with the outgroup instead of the in-group? And then we started over on the one here. So the x-axis is the quality of the environment, basically the economy, right? So one is where we deliberately set that so that you can fail half the time, and it makes more sense to be with the outgroup. But that's the border. Now, as you see, as the economy declines, it gets to be more sensible to work with the in-group. Why is that? It's because in fact, it's only in the condition where there's a big discontinuity. So if people are afraid of a bankruptcy, of a foreclosure, of losing their family, losing their business, starvation, anything like that, where there's a big discontinuity, then it can make sense to go for the more secure thing rather than the one that has the higher payoff. So even though the payoff's higher, you just can't take the risk of losing your family or losing your house or something. And that's why you wind up becoming more, at least behaviorally, more apparently polarized. The interesting thing here is that why was this correlating? Was because the real problem here is that if you have an economic decline, so you took a mortgage and you thought you could pay it, but you're making less money and less money, and suddenly you're struggling to pay off your mortgage. So it's actually economic decline that's the problem, as you can see from the title of the paper. Why this would happen with inequality increasing is that if inequality is going up faster than the economy is going up, then for most people, they're getting less money. They're in a declining economy because the top is creating false scarcity. It's taking all the money off in a condition of increasing inequality. Is that making sense to you? Hopefully. Okay, so that explains why China and Germany are different, because for historic reasons, they work really hard on manipulating their economy so that even the bottom always goes up a little bit if they can, right? So that shows why they wouldn't be linked with inequality there. Okay, so we also have, this is the paper that's published, we also have some data based in the Netherlands indicating that this turns out to be true. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to start talking about, so what can we do? Where does the DevOps come in again, right? What is it we can hope to change? And part of that has to do with who's responsible. That literally what responsibility and law are about is making things better. Iteratively improving, not just suddenly winning. It's not like there's a perfect state of nature we need to return to. We're always trying to improve on nature, right? Okay. So responsibility is basically a property of the moral agents. This is almost definitional. So the moral agents are the people in a society that we believe are responsible, that we hold responsible. And everybody, all the moral agents hold each other responsible. So there has to be some means by which they can do that, okay? And so that requires something like a peer relationship. If somebody becomes so powerful that the rest of society can't hold them into account, then we have a problem. Trust is actually similar. It's a relationship between peers where we expect that we know you might defect, but you're probably going to do the right thing. And so it's a set of expectations that society builds up. If people start cheating a lot, it breaks down, and then you have to expend more resources on just policing and things like that, right? But this is just, I have papers on this too, but I'm skipping over that. But accountability is the extent to which a society can trace and enforce responsibility. And that's what transparency is about. So people say to me, you're talking about transparency all the time. Does that mean we have to open source everything? Open source is neither necessary nor sufficient to give you transparency, right? It can be a tool of transparency, but we all know that if you dump, as we just saw, if you dump thousands or millions, apparently one time Microsoft turned up in court with a printout of 2 million lines of code and said, here, we've been transparent. So transparency is about being able to know the stuff you need to know and what you have to fix. And this goes back to what I said before. What you have to fix is that you're following the best processes. So you don't write revision control notes about every character you type. You write them at the conceptual level so that the programmers that come after you, including yourself when you've forgotten what you were doing, can tell why you did that, right? So yeah, we aren't talking about building AI we can trust. This is like the wrong kind of metaphor. AI is basically a corporate asset. Unless you really have written your own, then it's your asset, right? But we need to talk about, not about trusting powerful agencies, rather we have to kind of construct or co-construct systems by which we can hold them to account. Okay. So this brings me to the European Union. Sorry, everybody, American here, right? But no, it's good. I mean, I actually, it was weird. When I moved to Berlin, which literally my first day at the Heritage School was Brexit Day. But the American embassy there talked to me more than I've ever been talked to by American embassies before, during the Biden administration. And, they were kind of like, what are you doing? And I'm like, we don't need, some supplicant, people in Europe. We need a partner that can hold us up if we shoot ourselves in the foot again, right? I literally think the best thing we can do in the EU is try to make things work and show how it goes, and then then other people can look at that and do better, right? That's what we're always trying to improve. Okay, but this is what we've done so far. People talk a lot about the AI Act, and you can see this isn't the order I normally go on this slide, but the Digital Markets Act is the act that's specifically about addressing the fact that the United States stopped addressing the problem it noticed in the 19th century, which is too powerful companies having too much power. So Europe is, at least, it's a very innovative piece of legislation. It's not like you just break up the companies, although that's possible, but it's much more about negotiating with them and then making things worse for them if they're not behaving well, but then looking to bring it back together again. So more like diplomacy, where you're constantly trying to find public goods and ways to cooperate. And it's written in a law. It's really cool. So if you're going to geek out, that might be something to geek out about. The AI regulation is so boring, I almost feel like it was like a decoy to distract Google and Microsoft and those guys. All it's saying is that AI is a product, and that ordinary product law applies. Now, people used to say, you don't understand, software isn't a product, it's a service. It's like, look, writing software can be a service. A program can provide a service, but the software itself is a product. And people are like, yeah, but it's based on these libraries, and you don't know how good the libraries are, they change overnight. That's our problem, right? I mean, even as a scientist, I know that I have to release the entire suite that runs the simulations when I produce the simulations. It's like if somebody builds a bridge and they use bad concrete. This happened in Italy, and a bunch of people died. And it had been 30 or 40 years earlier that they had built those bridges, but they had sourced some cheap concrete, right? We cannot source the cheap concrete. Right? We have to care about the provenance of where the libraries come that we download, right? We have to worry about the reliability and the cybersecurity of those, depending on what we're building, of course. But anything you put on someone's infrastructure is a problem, potentially. So where are we? Yeah. So basically, this is where the DevOps is coming back in. There's some rules about what you have to document. It's unbelievably lightweight. It's actually the costs of doing that documentation aren't that high. And the AI Act itself only says you have to do it if it's high risk, by which they mean if it's going to alter people's lives. So for example, something that decides who gets loans or who goes to which school, things like that. So stuff that really alters lives a lot. But actually, quietly in the background, the European Product Liability Directive was altered to say that all software is a product. So actually, in a way, the AI Act is a little redundant. But don't tell anyone, especially in America. Okay. This is all based on the General Data Protection Regulation, right? And it's weird because people thought, oh, that was such a terrible thing. I was pro bono helping Google with their AI policy around the same time. And it wasn't just Google, like Microsoft and people were saying, oh, we're going to pull out of Europe as soon as you make that thing, as soon as that comes. I'm like, no, you're not. You're not going to walk away from 20%. It's not just 20% of the world's GDP. It's the 20% you're most likely going to get paid too, right, on delivery. Right? So no one's going to walk away from that. But the funny thing was that Googlers are pretty honest. You go back and they were like, oh, the GDPR is great. It's a single API to 28 countries. And I'm like, yeah, you know what the EU are? They're a trade bloc. You know what they like to do? Trade. The whole point of the GDPR was actually the general part. It was bringing all the privacy requirements of the EU into a single rule, so you didn't have to learn 28 rules, or even worse. In Germany, you have like every little state might have a different rule. I like to think that AI sort of has done for personal data what airplanes did for airspace. Before you could drop bombs on people, nobody talked about who's controlling the airspace. And before you could find every little piece of information about someone, predict what they're going to do, and pick out which person might be open to becoming a saboteur, things like that, you didn't have to worry that much about personal data. Although, yes, the Nazis used it, right? But it's AI is allowing us to weaponize, as well as use for good, the data that's out there. And then finally, but not least, there's something called the Digital Services Act, which basically is checking that GDPR is being obeyed on the things that we were most worried about because we saw the harms being done. So on people constructing profiles of us for manipulation or whatever, for targeted advertising, particularly in the case of elections, but in general, in the UK, they worry a lot about getting people to gamble too much, things like that. And then finally, what did I say? Targeting, well, what you can be, recommenders, duh, right? So, why are you being served the particular thing you're being served, whether that's search or whether that's like your social media thing. So, all of these things, we now have methods in place where we should be able to get information to check whether or not people are legitimately targeting us. Enforcement is a separate thing from having the laws in place. But the companies were reorganizing their architectures to provide this information up until this year, right? So since 2025, some of them, notably Meta, have backed away. But in general, they showed, they used to tell people, like researchers in America, it's impossible to have this data. Again, what can that mean? Right? You guys all know. It might slow things down a little bit to log this stuff, but it's not the end of the world. Anyway, so how am I doing? I have the time here, and we're leaving, 20 minutes for questions, right? Yeah, okay. So I'll go through this kind of quickly. Not to keep clicking on Eric Schmidt, but during COVID time, I was in something with the German government. Eric Schmidt was there, and he literally said, gee, too bad you don't have your own AI to regulate. First of all, I deny that West Coast US AI is strictly American AI. It's transnational, right? And it's not only that they have data from all over the world, they have talent from all over the world. And, for example, Google has fiber optic cables that wrap the entire world. It's more like a utility, a transnational utility that just happens to be domiciled. I mean, I say just happens. There's certain kinds of reasons why it's easier to build companies in California than it is even in other US states, let alone in European states. But basically, I deny that anyway. But the other thing is that every single state signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is every state, has an obligation to proactively defend the human rights of every single person within their borders, however they got there, okay? So we are all supposed to be making sure that everyone within our borders has food, has education, has access to justice, has shelter, right? And this is a kind of shelter. Anyway, I was going nuts about graphs like this back when Twitter was a thing you could actually read. You saw a lot of these graphs. Who's seen a graph like this before? You guys stay away from the political accounts. All right. So the idea, which is a weird idea anyway, is forget it, Europe, you can't help, so you have to side with us. What does that even mean, right? If we can't help, then just ignore us, right? But this whole thing is really weird because even as a computer science student at MIT, I had been taught that monopoly is a bad thing. So why are you only looking at the 80 biggest companies? Of course, you're here reading which are the most underregulated spaces. So yeah, lots of lies. Also notice, did you notice Samsung? In the small print it says Asia, but in the big print it says China, right? So, the Korea is not actually a part of China. So yeah. So anyway, so we decided, and I happened to be sitting right before COVID. I was sitting next to this woman from the Director General of Competition. It's the EU running over our heads right now. I don't know if you know, Denmark is right now the presidency of the EU. And they are literally meeting about like Russian drones right now in Copenhagen. But anyway, so Helena Malikova and I were sitting next to each other complaining about a graph like the one you just saw. And she went out like nights and weekends and figured out, first of all, that a good WIPO, so this is not all the AI in the world, but if it's being defended at the global level, right, and it's a subset, it's the stuff that's based on specific computational models, so it's not pretty, machine learning AI style. So if you look at all the companies that have at least 2, because her time was limited, at least 2 patents in 2019, and then you look at their market cap in 2020, then you see this very different picture. So that here the y-axis is the log of the number of patents they have, and the x-axis is the log of the market cap. So it's a log-log scale. You can see a lot on this graph that shows you that neither of these measures are actually perfect, right? Look at IBM and NEC, they're doing massive innovation. Also Huawei and Robert Bosch, they don't even have market capital, right? They're both too closely linked to their governments. But, so market capitalization isn't everything. We all know Apple innovates a lot, right? But they don't bother to defend their innovations through IP because they do both the hardware and the software, and they just think they can do a better job of protecting innovation by just being secret. But so you can see that these are both noisy measures. I don't know if you've noticed, figured out the color scheme yet, but some of the European companies that have the most market cap are Swiss. What is Switzerland known for? Okay, so innovations among other things. But so our initial paper showed that China and Europe were surprisingly similar in terms of the amount of patents they were generating and even their market cap. The thing was, it would have been even closer, except for SAP only made 1 patent that year. but look, the rest of the world combined, excluding the United States, is bigger on both those metrics than China combined with the EEA. So this whole narrative of there being this binary world is just false. And then the US is dominating. It's wiping everybody with both of those metrics. Okay, so what was it that they were worried about exactly? What was going on? At least what was being shown by those bubble graphs. There is some stuff going on, for sure. But anyway, a lot of people, especially now, are going, well, that was before AI. You mean generative AI, right? But, so this was actually somebody, Vivka Dorf's going back and looking for every grant at the years we had looked at before, so 2018, 2019. And you see, yeah, the EU and China are even more comparable than we thought on the patents. And then we published our paper. And you would be surprised, I had people from JP Morgan complaining that they weren't on our graph. You're like, what? Who cares, right? But they cared. Okay, so after we did this patent war seems to have broken out between Japan and China. so they've actually, the US is even falling behind on the patents by that. But look, the EU is doing better than China recently. Apparently, the Biden administration did some stuff with monetary policy that wasn't good for China. But anyway, this is back to the market cap thing. And if you look at right after COVID, there was a spike in valuations of digital companies. It's hard to even see what's going on here. So somebody had, in fact, Max Hampel, had this brilliant idea of just, okay, let the US just shoot off. And you can see that the EU and China are still, relatively comparable. And there's Japan up there. This is market cap of companies holding AI patents. Okay, which also indicates that all those extra patents that China and Japan were generating were maybe not real. Okay, but so what does it mean if that is a bubble, right? It's a really big problem because actually, if you look at the rest, not at S&P 500, the US economy has been going down, and a whole lot of the world's finances assume it always goes up. So this is a graph of NASDAQ, actually. If you take out, well, actually, you don't even have, it's the median. So the US markets have not been going up except for these few companies that are supposedly a part of this generative AI boom. So that's their valuations. And that graph reminded me of this graph. This was housing valuations after they deregulated mortgages in the United States. And that led to 2008, right? So we could be hitting, besides the climate crisis, also another liquidity crisis coming up. It's not insurmountable, but just so you understand that there's a lot at stake, which might be part of why we're seeing all this mayhem. When you have that kind of concentration, you're handing people power. And if you haven't read these books, and if you're at all caring about the stuff I'm talking about, instead of going, why? I thought we were getting a bias talk. Then I would recommend reading these. They're really amazing. So concentration produces interdependence. And then again, sorry to harp about this, but if all of your stuff is coming from one place, there's indications that all the weapon systems just stopped working that Ukraine had that were in Russian territory. And that's why Ukraine lost all its Russian territory earlier this year. All right? So again, we'll have to see if this is what's going on, but this is the kind of thing we all have to worry about. And that's why you're probably hearing more and more about Eurostack and things like that. We're worried about whether or not we can rely on these organizations. And if you work for those organizations, I strongly recommend thinking about what would happen if, unfortunately, the US did side with Russia at some point in the wars, right? How do you disaggregate a global organization? Or do you take sides? I think taking sides is going to be more problematic than disaggregation, but you guys should be thinking about that now, all right? So coming back again to the whole DevOps thing, it's the bias slide. You knew there was going to be a bias slide, right? I'm not going to show our whole paper, but this is an example. So in Finnish, and in fact in most of the languages in the world, there's no difference between he and she. But the way that large language models work is that you look at the words that happen to co-occur, right? They're just making likely predictions. And that was also how translation works. And it just happens that the word invests is more often next to he than she, and the word she is more often next to laundry than he is, right? And so that's why you're getting these translations from gender neutral into sexist, right? So what do we do about that, right? If you think that's the translator itself, then people are rightly, and it is, that's what you get standard Google Translate. But we know that if you've done a simple auditable algorithm, that's what you're going to get. So that was our paper that came out in 2017. We showed that the bias in our models is just replicating what's actually out there in the real world. So we first showed that it replicated implicit biases, but then we showed that both implicit biases and AI biases replicate real-world experience, like what proportion of people that are programmers are male and which proportion of people that are nurses are female, right? So you know that if you use that, you're going to get the stereotyped output. If you can decide, and this is a big thing, this is what all these things are trying to do, if you can figure out what fair even means, which is not clear, right, that becomes your test. And then what I was strongly recommending, and people were resisting for a while, but now this is what we do, right? Now we have all these guardrails and things, was a modular process, preferably with human-readable hacks, but even if you use some kind of machine learning algorithm, or unfortunately now this ridiculous reinforcement learning through lots of people that you hire in the developing world, either way, it has to be something that we can hold to account, and the whole thing is a translator. So don't have a moral panic if there's bad stuff, in some of your data. Like, it's about what are we releasing and what are the people seeing. Okay, and the idea is that every stage of the development is auditable, and that we can demonstrate that we met some criteria, that we're doing due diligence, is what they call it in product law, right? So people say, how can legislation possibly keep up with AI? It's moving so fast. What we're doing when we talk about product law is we're saying every sector does this, right? You decide what's acceptable. You publish it in your magazines, right? Your trade papers. And then the government just says, you can basically call the government and say, those guys aren't doing the level of effort that our sector thinks is necessary, all right? And that's how people get rid of like dangerous chemicals and stuff, that they make sure that other people aren't using the chemicals they don't want to use. that we're hurting their workers, right? This is a normal thing to do. It's just that we in software were kind of left out of it for a while, okay? All right, so one last paper from my group. There's a lot of argument, is AI only a tool? And, well, how can it be only a tool when it has agency? That doesn't mean, so that's the thing on the left, it's like people are holding AI tools or something. So that doesn't mean that the alternative is that AI becomes your colleague, right? It's not that now you can stick these AI agents into your hierarchy, because then, like I said, these are extensions of some corporation that built them, right? You don't want to just plug something in that you cannot hold to account, that you don't have any control over, that doesn't care about going to jail, that's just making money. It's like cameras and microphones from a corporation, right? So what we suggest is the right way to think about it is that it's sort of an augmentation of your normal human structure, and you need to make sure that the humans that are being augmented are still the ones who are responsible. And again, the new AI Act says that. You have to actually produce software when you sell it into Europe that people can responsibly run, that they can tell if it's working correctly. It's not something you have to go back to Mountain View and say it wasn't running right. The people who are the operators and the deployers have to be able to tell if it's functioning within the parameters that have been promised when they bought it. Okay, so that's that paper. Go quick if you want it, because I'm going to move. So yeah, robots themselves aren't our peers, but I'm behind time. If you want, you can ask a question about this. But the basic thing, you can't throw them in jail, right? It doesn't make sense. We're trying to improve, and the dissuasions we have work against other apes, right? So, and I hope you must have all seen this one, right? Is there a single person here who's not seen this before? You don't want to raise your hand, do you? Oh, okay, there are some people who haven't seen this. This is really a problem, okay? Right? We were just talking about this at dinner, I think, last night. So this is a problem. This is also a problem, okay? But we're the ones who can kind of make this back into and say, no, AI is just a part of our toolbox. It is not magic. It's not magic fairies that somehow are perfectly neutral or something. It's an extension of our own culture, and we're the ones who can take care of this, okay? So yeah, so Godzilla squashes AGI. Humans build and deploy artifacts and can be held to account for doing so responsibly. Human centering of AI is necessitated by this. The justice system, creates improvements, and the only way it does that is by being grounded in the concerns of us, right? The EU digital regulation is about securing the EU, right? And weirdly, I have had people from other countries saying, what are you guys doing? You're the police of the world? Like, no, we're just making sure that our own citizens are secure and our own democracies are secure, right? But I've also had people say, but how do we use it to protect ourselves? Well, you can read the legislation, and a lot of people have. In fact, China and Brazil both implemented text out of the EU's AI Act before the EU had gotten around to implementing it, right? But anyway, security and ethics are both require responsibility, and that's why those of us who understand and practice good DevOps have a lot to offer. So thank you.